So, I just wrapped up my 2-year Descent into the Veil homebrew campaign with my long-term home game party with a 7-hour session that ended at 4 a.m. And while we had a minor RPG horror story, thanks to some connection issues, overall, it is literally one of the happiest moments of my entire life. Is this what getting married feels like? But seriously, it was awesome. It was truly incredible, and I'll never forget this incredible moment I shared with incredible people. However, upon reflecting on Descent to the Veil, I realized something. Yeah, this campaign was incredible. I think that the vast majority of sessions were amazing, and I was going to make a video learning from the best and worst sessions of the campaign, but I can only really come up with one session that I thought was so-so, and I didn't think that was enough to make a video off of. But when I thought of the mistakes I made throughout Descent to the Veil, because, I'm human, I think I'm a good dungeon master, but just like any other person, I make mistakes. When I thought of the mistakes of Descent into the Veil, I didn't think of stuff that happened during the game. I thought of stuff that happened during my prep, which is a whole other beast entirely. I think that my prep for Descent into the Veil worked out for the most part. The sessions were good, but there were times where I made some slight errors. And while that's perfectly normal, I think that going into Campaign 3, I want to learn from these errors, and I think you guys can learn from my errors too. So yeah, sometimes I suck at being a dungeon master, but hey, that doesn't mean I can't learn, right? So, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so yeah, let's start off with that prep, because my biggest flaw when it comes to running D&D, the biggest thing I want to improve in the future has to do with actually prepping out the sessions. And that big flaw is that sometimes I forget that I have to prep out the sessions. Now, let me explain. I do tons of preparing. I spend hours organizing stat blocks and making item cards and putting them into neat color-coded folders and making sure all of my tokens are all perfectly organized in neat little folders both in my Google Drive and in my online VTT, so they're all ready to use. But even though I spend hours upon hours doing that and making sure all of the background stuff is prepped for the overall game, sometimes, many times, I forget to prep for the session. I'm prepping for the game, not for the session. I actually wonder how many DMs face this exact same problem. Because, yes, this is useful stuff. Having all of this information ready, organized, easy to use, that is extremely useful for prepping a game. But when it comes to actually sitting down and figuring out what the session's going to be about, what's going to actually happen during the session, what are the rewards the players are going to get, the plot points that are going to develop, that is something that I struggle with much, much more. For example, in the third to last session, the party descended into the Orphan's Vale, an eldritch tear in reality where horrible abominations crawl from the deepest depths of the ocean, covered in horrible, maddening storms. It's quite the formidable location, filled with Lovecraftian abominations, but unfortunately, when I was prepping that session, I spent 2 hours just organizing monster stat block folders. Now, is that monster organization going to be useful in the future? Absolutely. Was it urgent? No! I had a session in the next few days, and I wasn't even thinking about it. It was a very important session, by the way, the setup to the finale of the campaign, but I only prepped it the day of, hours before the game. Now, thanks to some good improv skills and my own personal affiliation with horror in D&D, I was able to make it work anyway, but I think I could have made it work better and made it work easier with less improv if I had just taken some time, sat down, and actually thought about what this session was going to have, what kind of content was going to be in the game, at least before, the day of the game. 2 days before the session is a pretty good place to start prepping, but even though I was prepping D&D, I wasn't prepping the session itself. I was just doing overall work. And yeah, like I said before, that sort of stuff is great. I think a lot of DMs do things like that, or maybe prepping sessions that are way in the future, or thinking about concepts far flung out in the campaign, or distant world building ideas. That's awesome. If you have fun doing that, that's great. But remember, as a DM, you have a responsibility to run a good D&D session. The campaign overall is also important, but if the players don't have a good immediate session, they're not really going to be focusing on that overall picture, right? In all honesty, usually the DM is the one who's thinking about the overall portrait of the game more than anyone else. That's kind of part of the gig, right? I'm not saying it's bad to prep in advance, alright? I'm Annie Edison. I spend hundreds of hours organizing Google Drive folders for Dungeons & Dragons. I think that's a valuable skill, and I really enjoy doing it. I have fun organizing. It's what I love. But at the end of the day, sometimes you need to put down the Google Drive folders. You need to put down your far-flung world-building ideas and just prep a session for your players to enjoy. Preferably before the immediate hours, right before a game. Okay, on the opposite end of that spectrum, that's about prepping too much. Here is a problem I have with improving during sessions. Sometimes, during a session, I will come up with a really cool idea, like just a loose concept in my head while players are role-playing, for example. If I don't have much to think about in terms of the actual game, I'm just listening to players go through roleplay, enjoying the roleplay, sometimes my mind starts to wander to some cool ideas. And sometimes I want to implement those ideas. And sometimes I really don't think about the consequence of that. And that is really, well, okay, not necessarily bad, but it certainly is chaotic. Now, chaotic is not necessarily a bad thing, like I said earlier. Often, this results in some of the coolest stuff in my D&D campaign. For example, during one session, I had this idea that a random bard the party met on their travels actually was some kind of extremely powerful supernatural being. Think Gaunter O'Dim from The Witcher. This being ended up being named Cain Miva, who, if you shuffle those letters around, that spells I am Vecna, which set up the entire big bad evil guy of this campaign. That was a spontaneous idea that went some really cool places, resulting in a 70-session awesome storyline. However, there are other times where I do that. I come up with a cool idea mid-session, I implement it, and I don't think about what it's going to do. For example, you can watch this live during Shadow over Carconos. During the episode Precious Memories, the party come across a vendor by the name of Usura. They are a tiefling vendor working with Torin, a powerful Illithid mind flayer who acts as their partner in shopkeeping. I think they're a really cool duo. However, I came up with this really last-minute idea to have this person tie into Maseo Takeda's backstory. Maseo being a human fighter played by Jacob Crow. I thought that this was a really cool idea to have Usura tied into his tragic backstory and the horrible acts he committed in the past. However, overall, the storyline, while cool, was fairly pointless and honestly just distracted from the overall plot of the game. I don't regret it fully. However, it could have gone really badly if I wasn't more tight with the roleplay. Honestly, Usura being integrated into the plot was more of a burden than I thought it would be. I remember in the immediate days following the Precious Memory session, I was racking my brain trying to figure out how I'm going to integrate Usura and the storyline with Maseo into the overall plot, because Shadow over Carconos was a short campaign meant to only last 10 sessions, and I only had like 2 left. So to say that I was tight on the timing was an understatement. I had to wrap this up fast, and it was a plotline introduced at the very, very end that was honestly, for the most part, unnecessary. I don't regret it, like I said before. It was a cool roleplay moment, but if I wasn't good at being tight with my roleplay, it could have gotten really, really bad. Thankfully, it didn't, but again, that possibility was there. I sometimes forget to think through my improv ideas. I don't think of the consequences. You know, like, oh, we're gonna need to resolve this plotline you just came up with at this very moment. That's not a consequence that sometimes I pop into my brain, and it should be. Sometimes as DMs, we get really, really excited during or even before sessions about concepts that we come up with, but we don't think it through all the way. And I'm not saying that you need to intricately plan everything. You can't intricately plan everything. Trust me, I'm a neurotic overachiever. I would love to intricately plan everything, and I would love for everything to go my way. But unfortunately, that's just not how the world works, and that includes Dungeons and Dragons. Sometimes your intricate plans are not going to work out. Sometimes you're going to need to improv. But try to think through the consequences, because eventually you're going to need to live through them. And if you're not ready, it can be rough, to say the least. Alright, this this one has to do with combat. I was going to do a whole video about D&D combat today, but it's a lot more than what I was expecting, so I did this instead. But I still want to sneak in a combat tip. You need to think about the number of players in your game. Now, I know that seems rather obvious to a lot of DMs, including myself. Like, duh, I have to plan around the number of players. But, like, seriously, even adding just one more player into your campaign completely changes the dynamic of how combat works. In the finale of Descent into the Veil, the 70-session campaign that was running for 2 years, the one I just mentioned, I added a new player into the game for the finale. Enel the Wanderer is a Goliath paladin who joined the party on a brief side quest in the middle of the campaign. I decided it would be cool if David, Enel's player, joined us for the finale, just to make it more grand and epic. The party were bringing together all their allies. I don't see why Enel wouldn't join them, and it was great to have him back. Here's the thing though, having Enel in the party, man, I forgot how much that changes everything about combat. Combats that would have been near TPKs became a lot less intense just because one extra player was there. Enel's a paladin. That's an extra bag of 100-some hit points for that party. And that is something that I needed to consider when I was balancing my encounters. Sometimes I forget that even just one more player completely changes the dynamic, and I forget to change around the way I prep. Now, luckily, in the finale of Descent into the Veil, I was putting the players against some really insane threats, and through starvation of long rests, the combats were still very challenging and intense, even with 6 players rather than 5. However, if I didn't understand how the action economy worked, if I didn't have access to Flee Immortals, the best monster manual to ever exist, if I didn't understand how long rests affect combat, then I don't think it would have gone well for me. I'm lucky that I have a lot of experience in this case. But I know that Crispy 2 years ago would have struggled a hell of a lot more, and even Crispy now struggled with making combats difficult. There were meant to be a bunch of fights leading up to the final boss fight against Vecna, and because Enel was there, those fights became a hell of a lot more easy, and Vecna had to be made a hell of a lot more difficult to compensate. Now, I think it was worth it, because damn, that Vecna fight was epic. However, again, I should have thought more about how Enel would affect the party, and I should think about how the amount of players affects an encounter. This is even more important when you're missing players. Sometimes someone doesn't show up last minute, and then you throw the party into an encounter that you thought they would have, but because there's one person missing, again, the dynamic is completely shifted. The Powers party level has gone down drastically, and you are risking a possible TPK, possibly. And you're risking a possible TPK, who knows? So yeah, think about the amount of players you have and realize that if a player is missing or if you're adding a player, you're going to need to change the way you run that combat. Okay, this is a lesson that I definitely learned with the end of my campaign, the final session. That session was supposed to be 4 hours, maybe 5, generously. It ended up being 7 hours long. We were up until 4 a.m. And while, again, it went well, I severely underestimated how long it would take to get through it. Holy crap. That is a big flaw that I have. Properly planning the length of my sessions. This also happened at the end of Shadow of Carconos. That was supposed to be one session. Fate of the Realm Part 1 and Part 2 was meant to be one game, and it wasn't. I had to split the episode into 2 parts because it was much longer than I was anticipating. Now, again, those 2 finales, they went great. However, even if they went great, you need to respect the time of your players. People have lives, and while luckily my players understood that the end of a campaign can go on much longer than expected, this is not something that's exclusive to campaign endings. There are times where I just don't properly plan out sessions, and I'm not figuring out how long this is going to be, and my players have work in the morning, or they have something to go to, an event to attend. It doesn't matter. The point is, I need to respect their time, and I'm lucky that I have players that are willing to dedicate to this game. I'm lucky I got people who show up consistently at all. I mean, scheduling is the bane of Dungeons & Dragons. The least I can do is honor the commitment that I've made to them. My sessions are supposed to be 3 to 4 hours. Let's try and keep it there. And I try my best to do so, sometimes ending sessions early. However, that's also a problem. Sessions that are ended early are going to be missing content. Sometimes I'm rushing to get through things and I forget stuff or I panic, and I'm not running the game nearly as well because I didn't properly plan out the content of this game. I need to get better at timing my games, and unfortunately, it's still not a skill that I'm very good at. The last D&D session I ran went like 3 hours over time, so clearly, yeah, not a skill that I am perfectly proficient at quite yet. I think my big thing isn't combat. I usually understand that combat's going to take like 40 minutes to an hour. But roleplay is where I really struggle. Sometimes roleplay with my players can take 10 minutes. Sometimes it's an hour. Sometimes my players just get really engaged in role-playing with each other or role-playing with an NPC. And I need to take roleplay more seriously as something that my players are willing to sink their teeth into. I am in a really combat-heavy game. I run a really combat-heavy game. So I underestimate the amount of love my players have for role-playing, the amount of time they're willing to spend doing that. And that is where my big fault lies. That's my blind spot, you know, especially when it comes to timing. Understanding that, learning that, internalizing that, that is something that I'm going to need to do going into campaign 3. Figure out where your own weak spots are. Figure out where you are not expecting your players to spend a lot of time. Do your players spend more time or less time in combat? Do they spend more time or less time in roleplay? What kind of characters particularly engage them? For example, in my first ever D&D campaign, I introduced a character you might be familiar with, Kalia Solfero. My players really liked her and roleplayed with her much more than I was expecting. That is something that I kept in mind throughout that campaign. Unfortunately, that skill kind of deteriorated in campaign 2. I wasn't nearly as good at that. But in campaign 3, I'm going to try to keep that in mind. Figure out what characters my players like role-playing with, figure out what my players just like doing in general, and finally realizing that they're probably going to spend more time doing those things. Alright, my final DMing kryptonite. The final thing that I need to figure out how to do. Reading. Now, don't get me wrong, I obviously can read. It's like my entire job right now. But sometimes I forget to read. I forget that I need to read through the homebrew magic items I put into my game, or read through monster stat blocks. In the final battle against Vecna, I was on the ball. Vecna was using all of his abilities and using them well because guess what? I read them. Whoop-de-doo. Look at me. Oh my god. That is something that I never frickin' do. And that resulted in a fight that was much better than anything I had ran previously. A lot of times, my players understand that when I go, oh, whoa, it can do that? That's not me trying to, like, psych them out. That's me genuinely reacting to something a monster can do because I didn't read the stat block in advance. Now, in my defense, most base D&D stat blocks are just multi-attack, sometimes with a different damage type if the designers want to get really frisky with it. However, I'm not using the base monster manual anymore. I'm using the big boy, Flea Mortals by Matt Colville, where the monsters have much more abilities than anything else. And that is something that I need to keep in mind, and something I wasn't keeping in mind. I was ignoring large parts of the stat blocks and forgetting about large parts of the stat blocks during combats because I just wasn't reading them in advance. I wasn't committing important parts of the combat to memory. And really, it's not even something you need to do that much. You just need to read it through once. If you're using 3 monsters in your combat, that's probably going to be, 20 minutes max of reading? Not even that. It's totally worth it to do. If you want to see me screw this up live again, in the 3rd episode of Crown of Deceit, the party went up against Kendrix the Houndmaster, a powerful boss that I did not read through fully. Kendrix could summon hellhounds, and these hellhounds had an ability where they damage players over time if the player stood within their range for too long. I didn't know about that until the combat started, until after I put down like 8 hellhounds on the battle map. I would have put down a lot less if I had read that ability in advance, because that ability completely changes the dynamic. The hellhounds are doing automatic fire damage. That's pretty powerful at level 3, right? I didn't read through that, and that was my fault. Now, that combat ended up going the player's way. They won, but that could have easily been a TPK if they were rolling even slightly less fortunately, and that is on me. It is my responsibility to figure out what the players can do, and more importantly, what the monsters can do. And on the player's end, it's not just the monsters I forget to read. Sometimes I don't read through all the magic items I give them, which is so stupid. For starters, I write a lot of the magic items I give them, so some of them have typos, and I should probably not let that happen. But on top of that, sometimes I give the player something that's really, really powerful, and I don't really think about it. It wasn't a problem in campaign 2, Descent into the Veil, but in my first ever D&D campaign, you bet your bum that sometimes I gave them magic items that are way above their pay grade. Now, to be fair to myself, which I always like to be, in that campaign I was brand new to being a DM. I'd only run a Curse of Strahd game that went really badly. You can watch that horror story in the cards. If I remember to link it, I probably won't. But look, the point is this. I need to read through stuff in advance, read through my notes, read through the items I give my players, the monsters I throw at my players. This stuff is important, especially when you're running the game as a dungeon master. I mean, seriously, we give our players so much crap for not reading through our spells, but sometimes we forget to read through our stuff too. It happens. At least, I hope it happens with someone other than me. Maybe I'm just stupid. But the point is, it's a lesson I've learned, and one that I'm definitely going to be taking into my third campaign. I think I'm a good DM. I think I'm good at doing this whole gig. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't good at being a DM. At least I like to think that. However, just like anyone, I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. And learning from those mistakes, that's what makes us not only great DMs, but better DMs. And that is what matters, especially when you're trying to facilitate the fun of yourself and your friends, right? So yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know what you think of my flaws. And hey, tell me about your own flaws. What are your Achilles heels of DMing when you are running any sort of TTRPG? In any case, though, if you enjoyed this video, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of our content, then you can check out our RPG Horror Stories series. We have an Incel Stories playlist if you want to watch something a bit more specific, checking out the nice guys and the incels of our game, linked in the cards. And while you're there, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down in the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment Achilles heel to let me know you made it to the end of the video. And that's like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Farewell.